Hello, everybody. Today we have a really intriguing episode for you. Today we talk about the attributes of what makes a rational thinker. But before we continue, I want to give a brief thanks to our sponsor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. Number one, it's free. There are creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will also distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more platforms. You can make money from your podcast as well with no minimum listenership, meaning that you can make money and monetize your work without having a million or even 100,000 listeners. You can start right from zero. Lastly, everything you need to make a podcast is in one centralized location. It's all in one place. There are no excuses not to make a podcast. I know so many people who want to make a podcast and they just are scared of it. Anchor makes it so easy. Anchor removes all the reasons why you should not make a podcast and gives you countless reasons why you should. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Alright, we're back. So, the attributes of a rational thinker. And in short, it's having a correct balance of emotion and logic. Emotion and logic, it can be thought of like the yin and yang, right? They're constantly dependent. You can't have one without the other. I mean, technically you can, but in the larger scheme of things, nothing goes without emotion and logic. Everything, when you boil down to it, every matter, every moral is boiled down to a balance of emotion and logic. Now, no one's to say that there is no disparity between the balance, right? But everything has a balance. That's undeniable. And we also must remember that it is all relative, and not to get too misogynistic here, but men tend to be more logical and women tend to be more emotional. And this is not, by the way, this is not picking sides. There are studies that have proven this. This is not a rip on anyone's biological structure, but we do have, and by the way, it's when I'm talking about relativity, where I'm talking about relativity in terms of rational thinking, I'm saying externally relative. What I mean by never compare it externally, right? It's not relative to him or her. This is not against me or against my friend or against, he's a more rational, he's a different balance than me. And we'll talk about that, how that actually manifests a little bit later, how that actually has significance and weight. Rather, one's supposed to understand how rational and the balance from within. It's a very within thing. It's not me against the outside. It's an internal thing, right? It's a very structured thing, right? And by the way, this balance is so deeply rooted, much deeper than the average person might think, because every single decision that our mind executes, every single small thing from every small little menial interaction to every small tiny to the biggest, right? Every single interaction everything we do requires this balance, right? So it is a gift from God that once again that this balance is so deeply rooted in us. Because imagine if before every interaction you had, or after every interaction you had, or anything important, or anything that had any sort of weight in your own reality, you had to before kind of go through, do I need X amount of emotion and X amount of logic? Imagine if that was a conscious decision before. Imagine how many brain calories that would take. So, that's something to really highlight, that what an amazing thing it is that it's so deeply embedded in one's own unconscious that you don't really have to do much fidgeting there. Of course, there's room for reflection, but this balance is quite rooted. So we're kind of, after this comparison, we're kind of we want to introduce a very it's a very piggish, misogynistic image in media. And this is very prominent in media. I'm not pulling this out of my ass. This is very prominent seen in the media, where this is probably actually where it originates. This is not originated from reality. This is a very media-like scene, American 50s movie type scene. So the wife would be talking very emotionally, would be a little bit out of whack, and the husband would go and kind of use his towering presence to hold her on the shoulders and kind of calm things down. Hey, come on, honey, take a deep breath, right? And it's very representative that the man is the all-knowing being of logic, and the woman is the outlandish, emotional roller coaster, right? And it's a very, very disgusting image to watch. I mean, cinema at the end of the day, right? However, there is a very simple, innocent truth cheapened and perverted to be, to this very, very I want to say morally gruesome image. So with that, we actually leave off and thank our sponsors once again. All right, so we're back. We left off on a very misogynistic note, and we come to talk a little bit more. So everyone has because this, I believe that this balance, I don't want to get too third eye here, but I believe that this balance of emotion logic is so deeply rooted in us, so deeply rooted in our psychological and neurological even composition. Not neurological, but it's very deeply rooted in our minds, and you know how everyone has a different balance, and this different balance, this variation in balance, is what I believe to be a very, very big factor in everyone's energy. In other words, everyone's aura, everyone resonates at a different frequency. Everyone resonates differently, right? And a lot of this energy is highly dependent on emotion logic. Of course, it depends on several other factors, but the basis, just like the basis of all our decision making, is based on this balance. A lot of people's logic is equally based, people's energy is equally based on this balance too. So it brings us to our first theory, that this balance of emotion and logic this change in this balance can alter one's own energy. And we'll talk about that over at a different episode. But the point still remains that I believe the way to change someone's energy in the deeper sense, because everything has the superficial, the way to change the foundational parts of one's own energy is to alter or to manipulate this part of this emotion logic balance. Which brings us over to theory number 2. That, this is a relatively simple idea. This is, again, just a theory. There's absolutely zero evidence that I've searched up. I have not searched it up, but I'm sure there is out there, that I believe that left-brained people typically are into straight, mathematical, logical, down to earth calculations, methodical. It's a very methodical outlook. But right brain people are very abstract, artsy, musical, very imaginative, right? It's kind of this balance, right? Again, just like the yin and yang, just like emotion logic balance. So just like the left brain, what is it? Right, the first word that comes to mind, the first attribute of the left brain is logical. And, so I believe that left brain people are logical, and they have this, so their balance is swayed more toward the logical side. I have no conclusive evidence to bring you, but it's just a little bit of a logical inference. So we come to inquire, how do I know my balance? This is something that, most people probably figured it out by now. Anyone who is able to understand a topic like this probably already figured out where they kind of stand. But, I always like doing a reference test. And it's like, a reference test is not, what I define as a reference test is, I like using this term a lot. What I like thinking of it as is a test of how I'm doing in this area based on an identical area. Based on if I'm doing well here, it's kind of like I can infer that I'm doing well in this area because I'm doing well there. So, so I always like, and earlier I said, not to compare externally, but that's that's the actual balance, right? This is how do I know my balance? How does it compare? So how do you look at it? How do you, which lens do you look at the world through? How do you look at life? How do you perceive the world around you? Are you making? Do you make logical decisions? Because always our mind has a habit of giving analytical thought. So analytical thought would be, for example, if you're in the zone, or if you're playing any sport or instrument and you've been in the zone, and there's this very very soft area, they kind of just lucid and fluid. There's this really calm zen time period of fluidity, right? And then your mind starts talking about it. That is analytical thought. So if you're playing an instrument, or you're playing violin, you're in this zone, you're taking a deep breath, you're flowing with nature, you're really feeling it. Then your mind, you're really feeling it and you're experiencing it. But then your mind all of a sudden would say something like, "Oh wow, this is really amazing." Right? And so the recognition of the feeling thereof will screw up the feeling in and of itself. Right? So it's the analytical thought, just like analytical thought, that gives its feedback and screws things up. So analytical thought, right? So what is the dialogue, right? What is your analytical thought about? What are your thoughts? In other words, what is the outlook you have toward life? And I'm not talking about morally, I'm talking about study your self-talk. Is your self-talk primarily, "Oh my god, he's gross," or "That's disgusting," or "The floor is gross," or I hate this," right? Very straight logical statements like, "Wow, this building is very tall, I wonder," very calculated comments? Or is it like, "Oh god, man, this thing is crazy, I don't like this"? Or is it, in other words, is it very outlandish type comments, right? Is it very big? Is it very what type is it? Are they emotional or are they logical? That's essentially what things boil down to. And another reference test is how does my own lens scale up against society, right? So is this, you must ask, right? You cite an emotional event. Say God forbid it's a loss of a friend, and you don't react to. Of course, this is a Jurassic example. This is a argumentative exaggeration. So relative against society. So let's say, God forbid, your friend died. Your friend passed away, and you don't really react normally, right? So according to society, this is an inherently. I mean, I'm saying that lightly because moral relativism, whatever. But I'm saying that inherent. This is a loss of a friend is an inherently emotional event, right? This is not. This is, well, we can talk about it if it's past societal, or if it's actually inherent in our minds. But this, we know in society, we respect. We classify the loss of a friend as a highly emotional event. And that would be the society's lens. Now, our lens, let's say your lens, is super, super logical. You feel very little emotion, right? And you kind of, I mean, yeah, he was a great friend, but, how am I going to get my taxes done because he already did that? You think of the logical side, and you kind of shrugged yourself and said, right? So, I'm pretty logical would be an appropriate response. So, we come to see how, had it not been for society and your comparison to it thereof, you would not be able to come to such a conclusive conclusion, really. So, a second test would be to compare one's own self to the society around him. Now, here's where we dive into really interesting topics. But before we dive into this, a little bit of an etymological breakdown of the term rational, what it brings about, and how it ties into the attributes of a rational thinker. I want to give another brief thanks to our sponsor. All right, so we're back. So I want to dive into the word rational, how it kind of works in the English language, and kind of see how it ties into the attributes of a rational thinker. So when someone says rational in conversational terms, it brings about normal and logical thoughts, right? So when someone says, if I say, "Oh, I hate him so much, he's so annoying," and someone says, "Hey, let's be rational about this," they mean, "Hey, get your emotions in check, let's be logical." So automatically we make the connection that rational somewhat equals being logical and normal. So after all, I mean, logic is the common language. As we're going to explore, logic is the common language, just like a language, of just like love or sign language or emotions. Logic is a language too, and unfortunately, common logic is not something is not a language we all speak. So, often we have seeing. I mean, really, a lot of times many people have a difficulty seeing past a language that's not English, right? Language is so deeply rooted in us as the writing and reading and normal English, like that we're not able to communicate. We can't tie the term communication and what it means to something that's not a language like English, for example, like logic, right? So a lot of us have a difficulty seeing past something that's not English, but this is a very, very literal thing. Rationality is a literal language. Rationality is a means of communication. It is an actual way to communicate, and one of our five senses, of course, is our mouth, right? Speech, or is it? Speech is a very, very an important sense, and because speech is such an important sense, we often associate only things that can come out of our mouth as speech, right? But speech is but communication is the bigger umbrella here, and we come to from broadening the term of communication to rationality, we understand that we're going to introduce the fact that the world is built on logic. Mentally, right? The planets, if you kind of look at the planets' mental composition, right, and that takes a lot of anthropomorphizing, right, making dull or non-living objects, relatively non-conscious objects, into human form, right? Like, how the river flows. It reminds me of doing karate, right? That's in a brief example of anthropomorphizing nature. So not to get too deep into that, right? But the mental composition of the planet and the physical aspect of the planet is all built on logic. It's all built on logic. So, and I just want to kind of clarify a pretty big double standard here. So if in normal conversation, if someone says you don't get logic, you're an idiot. So if someone calls you an idiot, what does that mean? It means that you clearly do not understand. Right, so you don't get logic, you're an idiot. If you're called an idiot, you are incapable of understanding logic. That is the underlying meaning behind being called an idiot. However, if the statement is made toward you that you don't get emotions, right, you don't understand emotions, the normal and rational response, pretty ironic, would mean, well, everyone's different. We're all different. That's usually what everyone says. If you don't get emotions, well, everyone's different. We all are on our own different emotional path. But if you don't get logic, oh well, then you're suffering from, you're obviously disabled in some way. So not to get too third eye on here, as I said earlier, but this is why all feud is based on emotion. This is why every argument is somehow in some way based on emotion, right? I'm getting a little bit metaphysical here, right? But we affirm our reality through our senses. You confirm, if I'm telling you that that there is an animal in front of you, if there's a cow in front of you, the way you confirm such a reality is through sight, right? Of course, you can hear sound, right? But we usually confirm our reality. If I told you a cow was standing in front of you, or a cow was right in front of you, you would confirm that through your senses, through your five senses, like vision, and even more so, we affirm all our reality through physics. Gravity, forces of nature are deeply indispensable logic, right? You cannot. Physics is only logic. There is no room for anything except logic when it comes to physics. This comes to show that the world, the actual planet, is built on sheer logic. there is logic embedded in every small force in reality. Is all logic. I see A, for example, it kind of ties into the way we're conditioned. The mind sees A, it expects B. I drop this pen, I expect the pen to fall. There is no such thing as the pen floating in the air. If I drop this pen, I expect it to fall at a certain rate. And this conditions the mind to be. This causes logic, right? This conditions the mind to have an underlying need and hunger for logic. So we kind of learn from here that physics and, as we said earlier, physics and logic are under the same umbrella. Physics and logic work hand in hand. This means that the actual architectural composition of planet Earth is logical, and this makes every human need logic. This makes the hunger for logic, right? So when someone says, "Oh, you're an idiot," right? Where does that hunger come from? Where does the need to? Where does the overall? Okay, I understand logic, right? There's a need for logic. There's an overall human hunger for logic, right? Where does that come from? Right? I believe it's a conditioning from our circumstances around us, right? And what is the circumstances around us? I see A, I expect B, right? 1 follows 2. I see one event, 2 would follow 1, right? All these small, tiny things, right? Everything conditions us, and so this is why rational. This kind of answers why rational brings logic into mind, right? Rational brings logic. And rational, it comes to mind that, being a rational thinker usually means be a logical thinker. But we observe that a real thinker consciously incorporates emotions into every matter he or she deals with. And with that, we close. So thank you again very much for listening. All your support helps. Be sure to tune in daily for new episodes of Existential.